years later is, for those of you who might not know, is it's been a century since this reservation was open to homesteading. So that's what the centennial's about. And in some ways, for Salish Kootenai people, it might be like Indians celebrating 1492, because what we're talking about is, from some perspective, an invasion of our homeland. In some ways, it's a story of survival, and in some ways, it's a story of how people excel, how we come from people, in all honesty, that know that when you get knocked down, you get back up. But the story's actually going to be a little bit longer than 100 years. And part of it is for people to truly understand from where we've been to where we're going. So the map that you're looking at now is actually the Aboriginal territories of the tribe. It includes Montana, Idaho, parts of Washington, parts of Canada. And when you look at that map, that's the area that the Salish, the Pend d'Oreille, the Kootenai, the Kalispels, that we utilized in a time sometimes when uses overlapped. But the Aboriginal territories of the tribe, and if you think about this in the context of, say, early 1800, 200 years ago, territory of utilization by the Confederated Tribes was probably 22 million plus acres. We have stories of Salish hunting in the only place it could be was in the Black Hills. But you tell the Sioux people that today and they kind of shake their head. And Assiniboines and Sioux shake their head at me when I say that I can show historical documentation that in the early 1800s, Salish were sighted on the Missouri River, actually east of Wolf Point. In the early 1800s, you were getting pressure both from the East Coast and the West Coast on tribes to move inward. And so as that pressure increased, then we get introduction of the Crows, of the Sioux, of the Blackfeet, into areas that many times were traditional areas for Salish, Pend d'Oreille, Kootenai, Kalispels. Then along comes the Treaty of Hellgate. And this is more a story about this reservation and where we've come since the opening of the reservation. And without getting into a whole long lecture on constitutional law, the Constitution of the United States provides for several important things. One of those is that laws of Congress and treaties lawfully entered into shall be the supreme law of the land. So in the Treaty of 1855, I once had somebody ask me, well, where's your title to the land? Well, my title to the land is the Treaty of 1855. But it's an interesting document. It was a negotiated treaty whereby tribes gave up land to the United States so the United States could get title in that land. And in return for that was a guarantee that a portion of that land would become permanent tribal homeland. So in that process, from the Treaty of Hellgate, we went from Aboriginal territory that we used to a treaty document that recognized that the tribes as the Flathead Nation of the treaty utilized roughly 12 million acres. In the terms and the language of the treaty, set aside this area, the map that's on the screen now, that we know today as the Flathead Indian Reservation, roughly 1.25 million acres of land, under the treaty was essentially set aside for the exclusive use and benefit of the confederated tribes that entered into the treaty. And that's an important point, for the exclusive use and benefit of the tribes to be their homeland. As we talk about, that was one thing that the treaty did. The other thing that it did was that it discussed a reservation in the Bitterroot Valley where the Salish were at. Victor, negotiator on behalf of the Salish, did not want to move his people from the Bitterroot Valley. The way to get him to go along with that was to say, as the treaty did, Well, that might be possible. We will survey the Bitterroot Valley, and if the president determines that it's fitting for a reservation for you, a reservation may be surveyed out of the Bitterroot Valley for the Salish people. The other thing was that people were not to settle in the Bitterroot Valley until that commitment of the treaty was fulfilled. That wasn't fulfilled. People started settling in the Bitterroot Valley. And in 1872, then a subsequent agreement came around called an agreement, the removal agreement. And the removal agreement was to essentially get the Salish out of the Bitterroot to what by the treaty was referred to as the Jocko Reservation, or as we call it today, the Flathead Reservation. And it never occurred. Charlot didn't want to move his people. A portion of the Salish, as a result of the 1872 agreement, did move. But it wasn't until actually 1891 where the tribes were forcibly removed, with, of course, the assistance of military, to the Flathead Reservation. Right around the same time as the removal, all of that going on, the country was of the mood that, by God, we need to civilize those Indian people all across the United States. So the Dawes Act of 1887 was passed, or the title of the act, the General Land Allotment Act. But there were two forces behind that. But the General Land Allotment Act, on its face, the purpose of the act was to civilize us natives, make us farmers, because by God, even though they got us on the reservations, we were still acting like those rascal Indians. We were still going off and hunting. The Dawes Act, the concept was, we'll turn them into farmers. And depending upon the reservation, allotments ranged anywhere from 320 acres down to 40 acres. The Confederated tribes were engaging in agriculture. Nearly 30,000 acres in cultivation in 1903. There were some pictures that I ran across in terms of working for the tribe at one time that were like 1901, 1902 Western Montana Fair. There were crops on display at the fair from the Flathead Reservation. In 1904, Indian cattle numbered 28,000 head. At the same time, the horse herds on the reservation were 20,000 plus. Obviously, the Indian families at the time were engaging in agriculture. They were engaging in commercial cattle operation. And look at the change. 1915, after allotments. However, the chiefs and the tribes, the membership of these tribes opposed the allotment process. They did not want to participate in that process. In 1904, we were lucky enough, or unfortunate enough, as the case may be, to get our very own Allotment Act. Heads of families got 160 acres, members of families and wives got 80. Once that happened, then the other provision of the Flathead Allotment Act came in. That dastardly provision that people don't want to really talk about. What happened to us when all of those Indians counted and got a piece of property, the rest of that 1.25 million acres would be declared surplus. Now remember, the original promise was for the exclusive use and benefit of the tribes. Would be declared surplus and could be opened for homesteading. Now after all the Indians were counted, after all of them got their allotments, the reservation changed from a green status, which was the first map, which was all tribal land, to kind of a gold color, I guess, which shows those portions of land that were allotted to individual Indians. In terms of total overall tribal ownership of the land, it really didn't change if you count Indians and the tribe together. So ownership of the reservation was still Indian ownership, but it wasn't tribal ownership totally. So in 1910, the reservation was open to homesteading. 3,000 lotteries were issued for homesteads of surplus reservation land. They came, they homesteaded. A second round in September of 1910 for another 3,000 homesteads. Because there still appeared to be good agricultural land left after the 6,000 lottery, the remaining surplus lands were thrown open for public sale. These 3 rounds of homesteading on the reservation caused the loss of over 400,000 acres of tribal land. Amendments came along allowing Indians to mortgage essentially their property, but there was pressure to do that from the big names of Sear, Beckwith, Sterling, the Missoula Mercantile. Part of the founding of it, it was a real estate business selling land on the reservation. These mercantiles would grant credit to Indian people. The Indian agent would grant a mortgage on their allotments. The mercantiles would foreclose, the Indians would lose their allotments. As one of our tribal members was off at World War I, there was an amendment to the Flathead Allotment Act that said if the Indian agent essentially determined an individual Indian to be competent, his land could go from trust status to fee status, meaning the county could tax it because he was competent or she was competent. And of course, Indian people who never had an practice of ownership of land to begin with, then briefly within a 10-year period, they were mortgaging their property, or in the case of this tribal member who was off fighting World War I, while he was gone, he got letters they were going to put his land into fee status. He came back, he hired a lawyer who said, no, I don't want my land in fee status, I want it kept in trust status. And the Indian agent said, well, our determination that you're competent to have it in fee must be true because you hired a lawyer to defend you. Therefore, you are competent. Therefore, your land will go to fee. So he goes back to World War I, and in the couple of years that he was gone, his land ended up getting sold under tax foreclosure. So he's giving his life for his country. He's tied to defend his property. The Indian agent says you're competent because you hired a lawyer. So remember that. We get into the 20s, then all of a sudden, I mean, you've got nearly two decades from 1905. So you update the tribal membership, and all of those members then get an allotment. And here we generally refer to them as timbered allotments because the lands that were really left tended to be in the foothills and on the mountainsides. And so there was a second round of allotments. All of those people who were on the rolls at that time then got an allotment. Most of the timber allotments were we're 160 acres in the timber, and you get lots of stories about those. My father's allotment is in an area that some of us call the Red Horn area, below Ashley Lakes, below McDonald Peak, on a very steep slope that was mostly shale. He sold it to the tribe when he came back from World War II in the 50s. We've gone from 22 million acres to a recognition of 12 million acres to a treaty saying our permanent homeland would be 1.25 million acres to, at this stage of the game, tribal land ownership is probably roughly around 400,000 acres. One of the things that I'm really proud of my tribal government for is from the very beginning, the tribes have recognized the importance and the integrity that comes with maintaining your own tribal homeland. Because by 1913, this tribal government was already buying back land. As we go through this process, and the tribes filed claims under the Indian Lands Claims Commission that was set up in the early 50s, tribes could file claims for wrongs that had been done against their nations with this claims court. And basically what you had to prove to the claims court was that you had lawful title and title was taken away from you wrongfully. Now, the interesting thing is, in the course of 2 different claims, for those lands lost in the Bitterroot, for those lands lost in northwestern Montana, the tribes were compensated for those lands at 47 cents an acre. Now, when the reservation was opened and lands were lost under the claims, the tribes received less than $1 an acre for those lands. The thing about the gimmick was you got compensated for the value of the land at the time that you lost it. How fair is that? Now, in terms of the allotment process, part of what I wanted to show you was The purpose of the General Land Allotment Act was to make us farmers, right? Well, it seems like these tribes here were doing a pretty good job of that before the reservation was ever allotted. What happened? The reservation was allotted. Indians were then forced not to use an open range system that they'd been using for decades. They were forced then to try to take their herds to the confines of their allotment. Now, what I understand from the elders of my family was at the time of the allotment process, at least in my family tree, was the family had over 300 head of cattle and had nearly 300 head of horses. And that my great-grandfather took his horses to Canada to sell them, many of which were Appaloosa, which ties back into our Nez Perce roots, because there wasn't a local market for them. Because the Missoula and Kalispell and local markets were so flooded with flathead livestock that they were virtually giving them away at the auction yards. And they had to sell them because they didn't have land for them. They didn't have, on 160 acres or 80 acres for your family member, given the technology of agriculture at the time, how are you going to raise that many cattle? You can't. You have to sell them. You can't range that many horses. You have to sell them. So tens of thousands of horses and cows got sold, flooded the market. The homesteaders that are homesteading the land are buying that reservation livestock back and bringing them back on the reservation, only on their homesteads. Now, one of the things I haven't talked about, but intentionally didn't get into because it's a whole day conversation of itself, is on this reservation we being the Confederated Tribes, own the south half of Flathead Lake. Literally the south half of the lake. We own it. We've had to litigate time and time again to prove we own it. We own that lake. The beds and banks of that lake belongs to us. And when I drive up to Polson and look out on that lake, I'm proud to say that. But the United States did another thing. They recognized the beauty of that lake too. So in addition to the Flathead Allotment Act, we have the Flathead Villa Sites Act, where the government essentially auctioned off 5 and 10 acre tracts of land on the shoreline of the lake. So when you wonder why all of those non-Indian people live on the beautiful south half of Flathead Lake and hardly any Indians do, that's why. A few Indians got allotments along the lake, but not very many. And those other lands along the lake, why, they were surplus. But the government recognized the value of it, and that's why they created the Flathead Villa Sites Act. Thousands of acres along the lake were lost in that process. If somebody buys a piece of land next to the lake, what do they think? They think they can use that shore, right? Wrong. Who owns the beds and banks of the lake? The tribes do. That's what all the dock debate and dock permit issues about. Because when you own land on the south half of the lake, and if you're, well, regardless of who you are, even if you're Indian or not, the tribe owns the beds and banks. So when you build a dock, you build a dock on tribal land. That's why you need a permit from the tribe to build that dock. Part of that is understanding what happened and understanding that the land along the lake at one time was tribal land, and by an act of Congress, that other portion of the Constitution I talked about, which was declared to be constitutional unless it abrogated some portion of the treaty, and that's where our land claim came from. Opening of the reservation abrogated that right or promise of the exclusive homeland. One of the principal things that the Indian Reorganization Act did is it stopped the Allotment Act process. So for land purposes, no more allotments after 1934. The other thing that it did was any lands within the boundaries of a reservation that were still in surplus status were to be reverted to tribal ownership. So as far as a land issue, the Indian Reorganization Act did something good. Today, over 750,000 acres of land are held in tribal ownership. And it's an interesting fact that when I got out of law school and first started practicing law for the tribe, we didn't own 50% of the reservation. We owned like 43% of the reservation. So think about that in terms of how much land they bought in the 50s and the 60s to get back to this position. Today, with the land that the tribe owns, we own over 60% of the reservation between the tribe and individual members. Right in this area, as our reservation is described in the treaty, where the river leaves the reservation boundary was to be the confluence of the Flathead and the Clark Fork River. The surveyors, when they surveyed, went from a high point here to a high point here and left out 10,000 acres of land. Now, we call it the erroneous survey. And the tribe in the 80s created some interesting politics because the claim had been filed, the Court of Claims found that it was an erroneous survey, that 10,000, roughly 10,000 acres should have rightfully been part of the reservation, and one of the administrators at the time put a tribal reservation boundary sign at what the original boundary should have been. And boy, were there some upset people. By God, I didn't homestead on a reservation. I don't live on the reservation. But in the process, there was a lands claim. As a part of that process, there were some efforts to work with the U.S. Senate to have some other lands because of the politics of the time, where Senator Melcher really took up the cause for those non-Indians who live right along the river there, to not have that land reestablished. The tribe even agreed to not wanting those particular lands back that were homesteaded, but just reinstate those lands that were still in federal ownership, because largely those lands are U.S. Forest Service lands. Now in this area of the reservation and this area up here, at one time there was a legislative effort to turn the National Forest Service land up here to include in the external boundaries of the reservation in exchange for the 10,000 acres lost there, acre for acre exchange. There were some mining claims in that area, but nobody living there. Now, anyhow, the politics in DC, the senators change, the bill's still there, things started to look uphill, and the leadership at the time then decided to take the money for the 10,000 acres and use it to buy land. So what they did with the money was to buy land back on the reservation, but again, when was the land lost? 1855. The value at 1855 for 10,000 acres with interest up until the time the payment was made wasn't quite $2 million. So, but anyway, the land was lost in terms of the question. The tribes were compensated. The tribes, after fighting that, because the tribes fought accepting the money the same way the Sioux are about the Black Hills that you hear about all the time. The tribes here wanted the land back and not the money. And there was some effort, but because of politics, and of course Indians out in Montana are pretty low on the list of priorities when you start talking national politics and national legislation. Quickly adding up the numbers provided to me, there are 760,000 plus acres that are owned by the tribe and individual members. Out of that, 90-some thousand acres are in fee status. And non-Indian ownership at this stage of the game is roughly 416,000 acres. The state of Montana owns 41,000 acres on the reservation. The federal government, when you include the game preserves, the bison range, those things that are sometimes called federal camps with the irrigation project, is roughly 22,000 acres. And there's 76,000 acres of water body, probably largely of which Flathead Lake accounts for. I think what the tribe's mission statement is today certainly reflects the continued attitude for the past century, that the tribes will strive to regain ownership and control of all lands within our reservation and boundaries. And I think certainly in terms of adopting this mission statement of the tribe by the council was certainly a recognition of the realities out there. You know, when you think about it, yeah, it's possible that the tribe could buy all the land back. But what's the potential reality of that? Probably not. So it's possible, but not probable, I guess I would say. In terms of where we've been, where we're going. The tribe has regained most of the ownership of the land, but the environment's really been altered. We're dealing with the realities of that. We're dealing with the realities of how the world has changed all around us. The land ownership issue is there's values for open and unclaimed land. In terms of how the tribes have bought land, they have prioritized riparian properties. So when we go back to that map and the green down the center, Flathead River. You look at a lot of the green throughout the valley, it will follow the streams because those lands have been prioritized. There are other things, I guess, in terms of history and the politics that one could talk about, but in terms of the story, the 100-year story, recognize that the treaty was our title document. It said these lands would be ours forever. We opposed the Flathead Allotment Act, so we got our very special own act. Once the lands were allotted and surveyed, it was open to homesteading. Those lands were marketed out. They were settled. Over 400,000 acres of those lands were settled. And then allotments through mortgages, through being able to sell them, change their status from trust to fee, were sold to non-Indians. A lot of allotments went from tribal ownership to directly into non-Indian ownership through sale. So in that process, at the end of that period of time, less than a third of the reservation was in tribal and individual ownership. So when you think about 1920s, that less than a third of the reservations in tribal ownership, to today, where nearly 2/3 of the reservation is in tribal ownership, I think that's a pretty good comeback. When you look at it, there it is. 750,000 acres back in tribal ownership. The other thing about it is the government here, different than some other tribal governments, has taken very seriously their obligation to govern their territory. Not necessarily to the satisfaction of everybody, but we have pristine air quality. Why? Because the tribe made it that way. We have higher and cleaner water standards. Why? Because the tribe made it that way. We've insisted on more appropriate and economical and environmental-wise operation of the irrigation system. Why? Because the tribe insisted on those things. Almost all of those things I've just discussed, we've had to litigate. The quality of the lake, we've had to litigate. Who had the right to control the structures on the lake? We've had to litigate. Over and over again, we've had to prove our rights of ownership, which goes to the right to regulate how things are used and how that happens. One of the things that's out there yet, in terms of exclusive use, one of the languages was that the exclusive right of fishing on the reservation was to the tribes. If we really wanted to push that language, it says exclusive right of fishing. That's why we have this very unique licensing and regulation structure with the state of Montana, because a judge in the federal court said, exclusive means exclusive. State of Montana, you're off the south half of Flathead Lake and Flathead River, and did they come to the negotiation table fast? But land's a little different. But that's why tribal members are the only people that hunt big game on the reservation. Part of all of that exclusive use and benefit and that privilege. And we still have property rights off the reservation. So in the process, while we've gone from 22 million acres to 700,000 acres or 760,000 acres, we still retain property interests and we're still protecting our right to govern the territory, which includes 1.25 million acres.